Hey everyone, me Kevin here. Call me crazy, but I think the Federal Reserve isn't being entirely truthful with us going forward. Now, I'm saying going forward because we know they probably haven't been in the past with this idea that, oh, don't worry, we can still print money in March of 2022. Inflation is transitory. It's all going to be just fine. It wasn't all just fine. It really wasn't. We had to go a lot higher for a lot longer than everybody anticipated. And the reality is, maybe the track record of the Fed isn't one to really believe much in. But that's actually potentially why I think what the Fed is suggesting now could be entirely misleading. And I think it's important to at least consider. So I figured I'd make a quick video and slap together what Nick T from the Wall Street Journal just said that the Federal Reserve is up to. And then I'm going to provide my context and commentary about it. Remember that today is the 31st, and that means tomorrow is June 1st, which means tomorrow night we will have another price increase for all of the programs in Building Your Wealth down below. We do raise the prices, not because we think we want to charge people more money, but because we're constantly providing more content. So that way people who buy in early get rewarded and lock in the best prices. So consider that for either the productivity course on income and making more money with artificial intelligence, those lectures dropping soon, or the real estate investing course, stock investing course, you name it. All linked down below. You can also email us at staff@meetkevin.com and we'll get you taken care of. Okay, so in the Wall Street Journal article, Nick T just suggested that the Federal Reserve is preparing to skip a rate increase in June, but may raise rates at a later date this summer. Now that's fascinating because when it comes from Nick T, it's usually considered a leak from the Fed. Basically, we think either one or some of the Fed governors or even Jay Powell directly send a quick little texty doodle over to Nick T at the Wall Street Journal because he basically never gets it wrong. And that's not to say that he has a crystal ball. It's to say that basically when the Fed wants to communicate something clearly to the public, the easiest way to do that is to just leak it to the Wall Street Journal. That makes a lot of sense because everybody in finance generally reads the Wall Street Journal, especially when it has to do with Nick T's stuff. So it's the most convenient way to just happen to guide the market in a specific direction. Well, there's this suggestion now, according to Nick T, that officials want more time to assess the economic effects of prior rate rises and recent banking stress, although we don't actually think the banking stress is really banking stress anymore. We're getting a mix of data, like Chicago PMIs were soft, JOLTS was hot. We don't know, is that seasonal summer hiring? Is it serious hiring? What's going to happen on the jobs report this Friday morning at 5:30 a.m.? I'll stream it. What's going to happen with CPI on the 13th? We'll see. We'll stream it. But even beyond that, you have Loretta Mester suggesting, look, there's always going to be more data. What's the point of waiting for more data? Like, as soon as we get that more data, we're just going to go like, there's more data. Like, we don't need to pause. And then you've got other people suggesting, yeah, well, maybe it would just make sense to pause for June, and then we could always hike again in the future if we want to. For example, Philip Jefferson, the new Fed governors here, says the decision to hold our policy rate constant at a coming meeting should not be interpreted to mean that we have reached a peak rate for the cycle. Indeed, skipping a rate hike at a coming meeting would allow the committee to see more data before making decisions about the extent of policy firming. And Neil Kashkari, for example, suggests I can make the argument either way. And he's been kind of the bearer that's been like, oh no, we don't want to pause. So here's my take on all of this. My take is the Fed has made so many mistakes. The last thing they really want to do is repeat even more mistakes of the past. And probably the biggest mistake of the past was during the Arthur Burns era. Okay, this is from 1970 to 1978. This is a pretty critically important period of time. And what I encourage you to do is look at the Fed funds rate right here. You can actually see that on screen, FOMC Fed funds rate. On the left, I'm at 1967, and the right there is probably 1885 or so. So basically, just look in the middle. You see it's very, very volatile. And what I'll go ahead and do is just kind of go through some of these numbers here. I want you to consider this. We raised rates in 71, going up through 71. Then late 71, starting in September, October, we started lowering rates, probably because of pressure from Nixon and administration suggesting, hey, like, this is crimping my style, man. We got to lower rates. So they did. They lowered rates. Then they lowered rates, and then they started raising rates again as soon as February of 72. Raised rates, then we got to 73, then we lowered rates. Then in 74, we raised rates again. Late 74, we lowered rates again. Then in 75, we paused in May, and then we raised rates again going through September. Then we lowered rates again going through February and March of 76, raised rates again in 76, lowered rates again later in 76, early 77, then raised rates going all the way into 1979 when Paul Volcker took over. We know what happened there. Paul Volcker basically took over this era of, oh my gosh, inflation expectations have been ruined by somebody, certainly not the Fed before me, and I gotta fix this crap by putting on big boy pants and rug pulling everyone. It's because of inflation expectations entirely unanchored. They became a complete disaster. Everybody thought inflation was going to skyrocket and never would go back down. Today, we already know inflation expectations are reasonably anchored low. Yes, we get some volatility because of the news cycle and the University of Michigan Consumer Sentiment Report. However, the 5-year break-even is at the lowest place it has been in the last year, probably over actually the last 14 months, and that is generally the best measure of the market's expectations for inflation. So inflation expectations are anchored, which is great and a mouthful. But why do I bring up history? Well, I bring up history because the pause and then lower and then let's just hike again later, and then the pause and then lower and then let's hike again later, that led to broken inflation expectations. I do not believe the Federal Reserve wants to repeat those same mistakes this time around. They already have a credibility problem. Why do we want to repeat those mistakes again? You're better off just staying at 5 for longer. Like, you're better off just saying, stay at 5, and if we were going to, originally, if we were going to, let's say, pause in June and then hike in July and then cut in January, let's just go to 5 and then stay at 5 until March instead of another hike and then an earlier cut. Because solely and squarely, and of course it's my opinion, but it's my opinion that the Federal Reserve does not once again want to make the mistake that they made of 1970 to 1978. Because the mistake of this, Fed has absolutely no idea what they're doing, is literally what led to the Paul Volcker era of the early 80s, where we had a recession in 1980. That unfortunately never controlled inflation. Of course, we had some other elements causing inflationary problems back then as well, like in the early 80s, where we just went through a decade where inflation never went down, no matter what the Fed did. We left the gold standard, price caps got removed, we had an oil crisis. You had a lot of crap going on in the 70s, and while you had great music, you had horrible Fed policy. And it wasn't until Paul Volcker cleaned it up in 1982 with the second real putting on the pants, because he didn't even get it right in 1980. I know people really revere Paul Volcker, but he didn't get it right in 1980. It took 1982 to actually get it right. So in other words, almost sort of 2 smaller recessions, which together led to a lot of unemployment, peak unemployment of well over 10%. And this is what Jerome Powell, I believe, does not want to cause. He doesn't want to cause this roller coaster because it breaks the Fed's credibility even more. And in addition to that, honestly, I think Jerome Powell looks at his legacy and says, do I really need to create a recession if inflation expectations are low and inflation is plummeting? I mean, look at what just happened in Germany. Inflation fell well below expectations. We've been trending down nicely. Maybe let's just pause here and wait, because if we can actually stick a soft landing, guess who goes down as a hero? Jay Powell. My take. So in other words, when you hear about this pause in June, hike in July, I don't buy it. Unless the data comes in ugly, of course, then we're going to have multiple hikes ahead of us. But if that doesn't happen, it's bullcrap, my opinion.